You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is a journal that is managed by the Association for Fire Ecology, AFI, and is published by Springer Nature. We are very impressed with this journal, and we love the fact that we have really great people publishing it. And today is no exception. We have a trio of people here that are going to talk about this really, really cool paper that was just published in Fire Ecology. The name of the paper is Multi-Scaled Assessment of Wildfire Use on Carbon Stocks in the Sierra Nevada, California. The senior author we have here today, Kristin Nesbit, and then we also have Scott Stevens and Zach Steel. Welcome, all three of you. Kristin, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Bob. My name is Kristin Nesbit, and I am a staff researcher in the Wildfire Science Lab at UC Berkeley.
Wonderful. Welcome aboard, Kristin. Scott Stevens, you're next.
Hi, everybody. Scott Stevens here, professor of fire science at UC Berkeley, interested in fire and ecosystems.
Scott is one of our very important associate editors for the journal. So, Scott, I welcome you. It's good to see you again. And Zach Steel, you're up.
Hi, I'm Zach Steel. I'm a research scientist with the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station based in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for giving your precious time. I know you are all very busy people, so let's go ahead and talk about this wonderful, exciting paper. Kristin, do you want to give us the quick and dirty elevator speech?
Yeah, so we did a study on the carbon dynamics in areas that have been managed with wildfire in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. So using lightning-ignited wildfires that are burning under appropriate conditions to increase the scale of forest restoration and fuel reduction treatments is increasingly becoming an important management tool in our fire-deprived forests. But at the same time, managers are increasingly asked to maintain and even increase carbon storage in our forests. And our forests are really important in reaching our climate goals and sequestering carbon. So there has been some research about the benefits of beneficial fire in terms of fuel reduction and restoration of fire-adapted ecosystems, but there hasn't been any research yet on how greater use of managed wildfire might impact carbon stocks, which is really where this study comes in.
Yeah, it's a really important study and really timely. In fact, with the fires burning in the Grand Canyon, I see that these fires are sometimes using wildland fire use. Wildland fire use and carbon stocks are a really important issue because wildland fire use is a politically charged issue. Scott, can you tell us a little more about wildland fire use in these areas?
Yes, I'm happy to. You think about why in the world would you let fires burn in our landscapes? That's a great question. And we do it because fire is a process that's integral to these landscapes. We did a fire history at this site, and we saw that all fires ended about 1875. And then it restarted in 1974 when the first fire was allowed to burn in Yosemite. Yosemite was the second national park that actually allowed this. Sequoia Kings Canyon, 1968, allowed fires to burn in the backcountry. Yosemite in 1972. There's no doubt there's risk involved with this. The idea of allowing a fire to burn has risk. We saw that in Grand Canyon, unfortunately, this year. But there's also immense benefits. I always say there's no risk option when you're trying to reduce fuel on landscapes. It just doesn't exist. So this idea of allowing fires to take their course on land is really important, something that I would actually embrace.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, wildland fire use is the policy of letting wildfires go under prescribed weather conditions. So it's a very contentious thing, and this paper really addresses it well. So with all this said, how did this paper get started? What was the initial impetus for it?
Yeah, so Yosemite's been using wildland fire use since the 70s is probably the best example of a long-going experiment with this strategy, at least in California. And the other study area that we have is the Angela Adam Wilderness in Sierra National Forest, and they've been using wildland fire use since the early 2000s, prominently in 2018. There was a big fire there. In the latest iteration of this, between 2019 and 2022, we wanted to get back in there and resample some old forestry plots in Yosemite and add some new in Ansel Adams, as well as an unburned area of Yosemite to get at this question about how the carbon dynamics are changing over multiple fires and over time, and then as well as some other questions around wildlife and biodiversity as well. And one interesting anecdote about how this got started is we wanted to find an unburned reference site because a lot of our landscapes in the West still are heavily suppressed and haven't seen fire for a long time. But actually, it's getting increasingly difficult to find those unburned reference sites. Originally, we had planned on using part of the Sierra National Forest as this unburned reference, and that all burned in the 2020 Creek Fire. And so we really had to kind of scour the landscape to find places that hadn't seen fire in a long time. And we were able to find a corner of Yosemite that had similar ecological conditions that hadn't burned in a while. So we were back out there in 2021 and 22 resurveying a lot of these areas for these questions.
That's great. Thanks, Zach. I'm giddy with anticipation, Kristin. What do you think are the important results of this study?
We found as increasing wildfire use management comes at some costs to total carbon stocks, but that the surviving stocks may be more resistant to future fires and disturbances. So using both fine-scale plot data as well as newly developed remotely sensed data product, a couple of our co-authors developed. So we had these different scales of looking at the problem from both the fine scale and the landscape scale. And we found that at both scales, carbon stocks on average decreased in all basins that Zach just mentioned. And then in Illilouette, we could see that this loss in carbon was primarily driven by large losses in live tree carbon that were in a minority of plots that really had burned most recently at high severity. And then in the unburned basin, the average density of above ground carbon in 2021 was actually more than double that of the carbon in the two burned basins. Using the remotely sensed data layer, we could see that this basin also experienced a modest loss in live carbon stocks. So really this suggests that our fire-deprived forests in California are exceeding the maximum amount of carbon that they can sustainably store. The unburned basin is storing a lot of carbon today, but the incredibly high amounts of fuels in that basin really makes it susceptible to a very large high severity fire in which it would lose most of that carbon very quickly. On the other hand, while the burned basins are storing less total carbon, this carbon will more reliably persist into the future. The surviving carbon is stored in live large trees in the burned basins, and that carbon is more resistant to future fire and other disturbances.
Yeah, I thought that was wicked interesting with the fact that the carbon that was there before was just unsustainable and it was going to get hit not only by fire, but other things too, right? So, Scott, I heard that there are actually links to other studies for this particular study on carbon. Are there?
There sure is, Bob. We've been working out there since the early 2000s. And if you want to go see this site, all you got to do is take the road to Glacier Point and get on the Mono Meadows trailhead and just walk out there. 2 hours of walking, 3 hours of walking, or you can backpack a week. You can be in this site. We've been working out there, as you've mentioned, a number of years. We've looked at fire and fuels impacts, how fires are spreading. One study shows that if you're 9 years or less when you interact with another fire, you go out on your own about 90% of the time. That's incredible. These fires are self-limiting when you actually allow them to burn at the frequency that's needed out on the landscape from lightning. They just put themselves out. We also see that fire severity in these areas are stable. That just means the amount of forests that are being killed by fire is actually stable since the 1970s to the current. We know this is actually completely different outside of these areas. In most of the Sierra Nevada, fire severity, or the amount of trees being killed by wildfires, has increased significantly since the 80s. This place is very stable. Another part of the study we've done, which I think has really been interesting, is hydrology. We've been looking at actually how what about water in streams and water in the ground, in the soil? We find that we see actually more water leaving as stream flow in this site since the fire regime has been reestablished in the early 70s. More water is leaving per unit water in. We also see more water stored in the soil during drought, and we see actually less mortality of trees actually inside the Illilouette Creek Basin. I always say Illilouette is one of the functioning areas of the Sierra Nevada and California, maybe the most resilient forest in California, I believe. So an incredible place to actually go out, learn about, see, and experience.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Especially, I'm hoping that you'll publish all those results in Fire Ecology. You want to end this by talking about what the broad implications of this study are to carbon and fire management?
Yeah, so managed wildfire resource benefit is just one of the tools in the tool belt of trying to find a healthier relationship with fire in these fire adapted forests. And as Scott mentioned, there's been a fair amount of work out of his lab and others looking at the impacts or implications of returning fire to these landscapes. So carbon is just the latest of that. And we see some trade-offs there. You do have some losses if you're reintroducing fire, and that's to be expected, but you're having some benefits of more stable carbon and more stable forests, more resilient forests moving forward as we see increased, more severe and more frequent severe fire in these landscapes. And so forest managers, you have to balance a lot of these different resources, carbon as well as others. Managed wildfire, some of the research that's come out of this area has shown that managed wildfire is beneficial for reducing fuels, so reducing the risk of some of these mega fires that we're seeing that are undesirable for many reasons. It restores heterogeneity or variability in the landscape, which is good for a lot of things. It improves forest ability to recover from disturbances it improves habitat for wildlife. It improves hydrologic function, so downstream water provisioning for people. So there's a lot of ways that getting fire back on these landscapes can be helpful, and managed wildfires is one way that is promising. But we do have to recognize that there are trade-offs in this approach, as there are with all of our tools in our tool belt.
I want to thank you three for coming. Kristin, do you want to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. There were 3 other co-authors on this paper. We had Brandon Collins at the Pacific Southwest Regional Forest Service and adjunct faculty at UC Berkeley. We had John Battles, professor at UC Berkeley, and also Michael Golden, professor at UC Irvine, and then CAL FIRE.
So I want to thank you again, you three, for attending and giving us a rundown of this paper. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. If you listeners out there want to know about this paper, guess what? You can download it for free. Kristin and her team have already paid the charges to go ahead and allow you to download this paper for free and take a look at and read about these wonderful advances we have in fire ecology. I really appreciate everybody listening today, and please don't miss the next Fire Ecology Chats.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.